The first time I snapped a photo of her, I thought I was just doing what any decent neighbor would do, a quick picture. Proof of something petty and annoying. She slid into the blue spot. Big leather SUV. Sunglasses on like it was Sunday at a country club. And there wasn't a paper or a placard to be seen. I raised my phone. Took the shot. And in that second, something small and ordinary began to unspool into something I didn't recognize anymore. Into a story about pride, power, and how one person's little rulebook can bend a whole neighborhood out of shape. My name's Eddie Marlowe. I'm a retired machinist. 48. With hands that still remember the feel of a wrench and a gait that still remembers long nights on watch. My wife, Maya, she gardens like a woman who believes soil remembers kindness. We moved to Ridgeview Commons because it was quiet. Because the houses had porches where you could actually hear people say hello. Because the HOA sounded like an idea, not a sentence. That's where this starts, an idea becoming a law. And then a law becoming something else. Vivian Cross ran the HOA. She was polished the way a speech is polished, all edges made smooth. Every punctuation placed so it sounded clean. Vivian liked rules. She liked them like some people like a morning routine. She liked them the way some folks like their coffee strict and black. And they want you to accept it or get out. For months before the blue spot thing, she'd been the kind of person who wrote letters about lawn heights. About the angle of signs. About how many trash cans could peek above a garage door on Tuesday. Little things. Tiny corrections that kept everyone's noses to their business. Most of us tolerated it because the neighborhood stayed tidy and because it was easier to nod than to argue. So when I saw Vivian park in a handicapped spot at Silver Pines Market without a placard, I felt that twitch, the one that tells you someone's got more privilege than sense. I walked out with my phone. Took a picture. And then I sat on the hood of my truck and watched. There are rules for those spots for a reason. My brother came back from Afghanistan with one leg and the patience of a saint. And I've watched him calculate how much more difficult the world could be when a place that's meant for somebody else is taken by someone who can walk away. That thought is what made me call the non-emergency number. The officer came. He wrote a ticket. Vivian's SUV was towed. People filmed. Someone yelled shame. She shouted. That's the hook, public humiliation in front of the grocery store. And the tilt in the neighborhood began. What none of us expected was how furious that tilt would make other things. Vivian didn't lie down. She litigated. She sent emails. She got the HOA's newsletter to call me disgruntled. Which is a funny word until it's attached to your name in a mention that reads like an obituary for your reputation. Then came the small fines, neighbors getting letters for wind chimes that made the wrong kind of sound. For rose bushes that crossed a perceived line. For flags hung outside on certain days. It was petty. Sure. But that was the point. Petty adds up. Petty is a hammer if you let it be. At first, I thought it would end with another meeting or a back and forth. I thought the system, by which I mean the homeowners, the local police, whoever would correct itself. That's why I started saving things. Maya said to me, write it down. Save everything. She's a sensible woman. So I did. I filed the emails in a folder called Ridgeview, and I kept photos of notices. I recorded the weird phone calls. You start looking at everything like it's evidence when you begin to suspect a pattern. The pattern revealed itself the way a shadow does under a streetlight, slow but unmistakable. A friend of ours, Luis, who runs the pizza place on Main, had his parking sign ripped down 3 times. Mrs. Fallon across the lane got a letter for having a veggie patch, an inappropriate front yard display. The list was small on the surface and big underneath. Then the things got nastier. My mailbox was split open and the cards inside scattered like confetti. My tires were slashed one morning, and the camera by our porch caught a man in a jacket with a logo, the same logo I'd seen on an HOA pamphlet. We all have those little impulses to assume these things are random. To chalk them up to teenagers. To storms, but when you put them together, they trace a line. I didn't want to believe that the HOA chair could stoop to something criminal. I wanted to believe that someone as careful as Vivian would never get her hands dirty. But power changes hands in strange ways. People who begin by tightening a rule to make life better sometimes find reasons to keep tightening the screws. Sometimes they start bending the rule to their own needs. I realized we'd passed that place when Officer Harris, a steady, slow-talking man who smelled faintly of cloves, stopped by and said, "Eddie, you keep all that. Bring it in." Harris told me there had been a few other calls at precinct about placards, fake ones showing up at reserved spots. Drivers displaying paper copies of something that looked official but wasn't. He didn't say it outright, but his face told me he thought the threads might be tied back to someone who had reach. The next move was quiet. We started to play hide and seek with a camera. Maya put another one above the back door, like she was stocking up on proof the way you'd stock up on canned beans for a storm. We began to watch our own lives like a documentary. I learned to speak differently, less like a guy making noise and more like a man recording depositions. When Vivian knocked my door to apologize about the misunderstanding at Silver Pines, she said it low. Like a rehearsal for a speech, I smiled and said, "No problem." And I invited her to sit for coffee. She didn't. She wouldn't. She wanted her script delivered, an email. Typed. Printed. Signed. That was Vivian. Signatures. Stamps. Boxes ticked. What she didn't expect was that when you tighten the grip, people farther down the line start to push back. Then came what I think of as the midline, the sabotage that made the story stop being a neighborhood feud and start being an investigation. One night, I woke up to a sound like someone whispering over gravel. The dog didn't bark, which made me nervous. And when I looked outside, the camera feed showed them two men moving with the kind of casual caution that comes from doing this before. They slashed my tires and left an envelope on my porch inside. A note that read, "Stop poking." There was a logo on the jacket of one of the men, a small emblem that matched the printed seals I'd seen on HOA letters. It wasn't proof of Vivian's hand. Not directly. But it was a rope. And you could see the knot forming. That's when I stopped thinking in if and started thinking in when and how. The police came. Harris asked me to keep the footage. He said they were looking into fraudulent placard distribution and that this would be easier if we had recordings. I thought of Luis, with his ripped sign, and of Mrs. Fallon and her vegetable patch. I thought of the blue spot at the market and how small acts can crystallize into something dangerous. When power becomes a job that someone is paid to perform for themselves, they begin to use it like currency. What none of us had counted on was that it wasn't just about fines and humiliation. Vivian had a network. It took the detectives a couple of weeks and a stack of subpoenas and a lot of late nights to find it. But when they did, it looked like someone had turned a civic structure into a side hustle. There were copies of placards, blank but for a space to write names. There were printed forms with the HOA letterhead. There were bank transfers in small sums to AP. Oh. Box. Shock is a funny reaction. It's a split between holding your breath and exhaling so fast you forget what you were thinking. I felt it, not that I was surprised. More like someone had explained the last few months in one sentence. The detectives assembled a plan that felt, for lack of a better word, cinematic. They wanted to set a trap to expose the distribution, and they needed someone on the inside to bait it. I volunteered because I had this strange, stubborn faith that the truth could, sometimes, be performance-proof. The plan was simple and stupid and somehow elegant. An undercover officer would pose as someone needing a reserve placard. The transaction, if it happened, would be recorded. We'd get names. We'd get cash flow trails. It felt like theater. Except theater sometimes ended in handcuffs. We staged a meeting at the clubhouse during a charity luncheon. A typical HOA event, fake smiles. Casseroles. People engaged in the small pleasures of keeping order. Vivian was there. Perfect as always. Like a headline made human. The undercover officer, a woman named Rachel, who had the patient courage of someone who has done this before, moved through the crowd and found Vivian. I was on the edge of the room, holding my coffee too tight, listening to the hum of conversation like static before a storm. I remember thinking of the blue spot and how a simple act of thoughtlessness had led to this full room of potted plants and forced smiles. Vivian took the bait. She smiled the smile of a woman who is certain the script is on her side. She said the words I had come to know. We have processes. Rachel said, I just need a placard for my husband. He can't always make the appointments the county requires. Vivian nodded. And it's a little thing. But when people nod, that's where agreements live. Vivian discussed a fee, which, to anyone watching, should have set off an alarm. But she did it in a way that sounded like generosity. We'll help you. For a small donation. The small donation arrived in cash. Vivian's hand passed the form. A signature was inked. And then that quick the detective signaled. The microphones picked up the exchange. The camera that Maya had lent to the team had a shot from across the room. And for a second, everything felt like it had the texture of a movie. Vivian tried to keep it calm. She said, "This isn't illegal." With the kind of conviction that is supposed to bend law toward custom. That line, "this isn't illegal," is the kind of sentence people repeat to themselves when they've crossed an ethical border and their heart is trying to catch up. That day, it didn't catch up. Harris and his team moved in. Orders were read. People were filmed placing things down, picking things up, trying to pretend nothing was happening while reality walked in. When the duffel bag, yes. The cliché duffel bag was opened and a stack of placards tumbled out like a bad deck of cards. You could feel the room breathe in and then out like one thing. There was a kind of relief in the sound. A client in the back, a man I'd seen as a neighbor and not much else, looked shocked to learn he'd paid for something that wasn't right. I remember looking at Vivian's face then stripped. Not of dignity, but of performance. She was, for a sliver of time, a person and not a title. Court is a strange machine. It flattens some things and expands others. Vivian was charged. Some of the buyers were fined. There were apologies written that felt thin as tissue. A few people left Ridgeview. Some families got quiet letters from lawyers. The HOA board dissolved under the pressure. The paperwork said so. And then one Saturday, a small group of us gathered in the park and decided on a new way to run things. We voted on transparency measures. We set up a small committee. We added cameras not to spy on each other, but to protect citizens. There was, I'll admit it, an addictive satisfaction in seeing the rotten thing rot in public. But the hard part is that justice doesn't stitch everything back to the way it was. There are holes. Trust, once punctured, doesn't always puff back up. Mrs. Fallon still looked at visitors with a quiet, defensive angle to her smile. Louise kept the pizza place open. But he lost business for a bit because people on either side of the argument preferred different loyalties. And what about Vivian? I don't want to paint her as a cartoon villain. She had motivations: the need to control, the habit of thinking in rules, the sense that the HOA made her important. Those are things people understand when they take a moment to look. Maybe she convinced herself she was helping. Maybe she didn't. People are complicated, and so are their justifications. The personal cost sat with me for months. I'd lie awake and run scenes in my head: the market, the tow truck, the luncheon, the bag spilling its secrets, and sometimes the images blurred into a question that doesn't have neat edges. At what point does enforcing order become an abuse of power? We had rules to keep lawns neat and to make sure the paint matched the neighbor's paint. But somewhere along the line, the rules had become the point, not the means. And that's what I think people voted against when they voted to dissolve the board. Not rules themselves, but rules that stop being about community and start being about ego. There were small reparations. The county did an ADA audit and fixed a few entrances. The blue spots, the thing that started it all, got respect again. People who needed them could use them without someone else's entitlement stealing a moment of access. That was the practical win. And it felt good in a way that made you hush. But the community had to learn something else: how to watch itself. How to notice when a neighbor crosses a line from enforcing rules to enforcing a personal narrative. I don't tell you this as a sermon. I tell it because sarcasm, mockery, and a photograph can change things. I tell it because I learned you can be a man who rounds up evidence, photos, receipts, emails, and still be the kind of person who sits on the porch and laughs with the neighbor. The choice isn't always binary. Sometimes you push back loud enough for others to hear. And sometimes you push back quietly so the law can do its job. Both have their places. Both are messy. Post-trial. I found myself drawn into small acts of rebuilding, hosting a monthly potluck where the agenda was banana bread and listening, starting a mini committee to review any HOA notices before they went out, teaching a class at the community center about citizens' rights and how to document harassment. Maya took over the garden funds and gave the plot next to hers to Mrs. Fallon so she could expand the vegetables the way she wanted. We did the slow work of trust building by having people show up. We discovered that most folks were tired of drama. They wanted it quiet. They wanted it fair. And they appreciated rules only when rules serve people. The biggest lesson, though, is the easiest one to forget. People who wear power like an armor don't always see the cracks until they're on trial. People who need help, the ones who rely on a blue spot or a reserved placard or the patience of neighbors, don't want speeches. They want access. The world is full of tiny kindnesses that cost almost nothing and mean everything. Put a ramp in. Leave the spot open. Don't park where you shouldn't. These are tiny ethics. They're small gestures that say, I noticed you. You matter. I've thought a lot about Vivian since then. I watch her sometimes from a distance. In town, where you can see people change clothes and muffle the old titles. I don't hate her. I don't wish her harm. What I wish is for everyone in a position of authority to remember that following the letter of a rule isn't the same as doing what's right. I wish for a world where being in charge comes with the humility to ask, who does this really help? If there's a final image I want you to carry, it's not the drama of the luncheon or the sound of the tow truck. It's Maya planting a small blue flag by the sidewalk. Not as a mark of victory, but as a reminder. She planted it the summer after the trial. And she told me she put it there for anyone who needed to remember the easiest thing: watch out for the other person. It fluttered in the light wind, modest and bright. And people walked by, and some smiled, and some didn't notice at all. That's the truth about community. Some will see the flag and understand. Some will walk past. Both things will happen. And that's why we keep talking. Keep fixing. Keep voting. Keep planting. So here's where I leave it with you, and I want to hear from you. Because I believe these aren't just my thoughts. They're ours to argue over. Was I right to photograph that SUV? Was Vivian a villain or a symptom? When does enforcement become abuse? And what do you do when the person enforcing the rule is the one breaking the spirit of it? Drop a comment with your take. Tell me about a time you saw something similar or a time you had to choose between peace and principle. Share it. Argue it. And if you feel like it, hit that subscribe button so we can keep talking about the small things that make up the world. Because at the end of the day, it's the small things: the blue spot, the placard, the neighbor who stops to help, that tell us what kind of place we're trying to be.